She was about to say yes to the love of her life, but he never showed up. Alone with the bouquet trembling in her hands and her heart in pieces, Grace thought this would be the most humiliating day of her life, until the door opened and the groom's brother walked in. But he didn't come to apologize. He came to offer something unimaginable, a wedding, right there, with him. Not out of pity, but for a reason she wouldn't understand until much later. And what happened next? No one could ever predict. If this story touches you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like and tell us in the comments. Where are you listening from? Your support keeps the flame alive, turning every pain into true love. The air inside the bridal suite was unnervingly still, so still it felt almost unnatural, as though time itself had paused to hold its breath. Grace Sullivan stood by the window, her lace veil cascading down her back, her hands trembling as she clutched the bouquet. Outside, guests murmured beneath chandeliers and white satin ribbons. The soft sounds of clinking glasses, laughter and string music drifted faintly through the door. But he wasn't coming. 42 minutes had passed since Lucas should have walked down the aisle, and the silence from the other side had transformed, no longer just silence but betrayal, echoing louder than any choir. Grace's chest tightened as the makeup artist gave her a sympathetic glance and quietly stepped out. Her fingers gripped the edge of the vanity. Her mascara was perfect, her grandmother's pearl earrings in place, but her heart barely hung on. She tried to breathe, but each inhale was jagged, like her body already knew what her mind couldn't accept. Then a knock, one knock. Firm, confident, not hesitant like someone delivering bad news. She turned. The door opened slowly, and in stepped a man she barely knew, at least, not personally. He wasn't Lucas. He was taller, darker, and carried with him an energy that seemed to shift the air in the room. His suit was tailored to perfection, like it had been sewn directly into his skin. His tie, midnight blue. His presence, overwhelming. But his expression, calm, almost too calm. Grace stared at him, confused, vulnerable, every part of her screaming to understand what was happening. Why he, this man, was here, not her groom, not her fiancé, but him. He closed the door behind him without a sound, walked forward without asking. No hesitation, no apology. Then he said it, clear, steady, unshaken. Grace, I know this isn't how your day was supposed to go, but if you let me, I'd like to fix it. Her breath caught. I'm offering to marry you. Right now. Today. In front of everyone. She blinked. Not a joke. Not a stunt. No panic. Just that same infuriating calm in his voice. You don't have to be humiliated out there. I'll stand beside you. Walk with you down that aisle. Say the vows. To make sure no one pities you. Grace dropped the bouquet. The flowers hit the floor in slow motion. Her mouth parted, but no words came out. She finally found her voice, cracked and breathless. Why would you do that? He hesitated, just for a second, the first crack in his composure. You deserve to be chosen, even if it's not how you imagined. Chosen. The word pierced her more than she wanted to admit. Grace turned away, her hands gripping the edge of the dressing table. Her reflection stared back at her like a stranger, cheeks flushed, eyes glassy. I don't even know your name, she whispered. He stepped closer. Cole. Cole. Her voice broke around it. You're serious? I wouldn't be here if I weren't. Her heart pounded. This wasn't real, it couldn't be. A man she'd only seen in passing, at dinners, family gatherings, always from a distance, always a shadow beside Lucas, was standing here, offering her a way out. Or maybe a way in. And yet, was it madness to consider it? Was it bravery? Or just the desperate instinct to protect herself from a shame too sharp to endure? She turned back to him. And after the wedding? He didn't blink. You can decide what happens next. We can disappear from the public eye. No one needs to know anything beyond today. Her throat closed around the lump forming. He was offering dignity, a shield, a scandal rewritten as a surprise ending. But there was more behind his eyes. Something she couldn't name. A pull. Not pity, not obligation. Something else. She could hear the music shifting outside, guests getting restless, whispers floating in. Her world was splitting in half, and she had seconds to choose which part she wanted to keep. "Yes," she said too softly. Cole stepped closer. "Grace." "Yes," she said again, stronger. "If I walk out there alone, I'll never recover. I know myself. I'll break. So if you're offering me something real, even if it's temporary, even if it doesn't make sense, it doesn't have to make sense." His voice softened now. "It just has to matter." He offered his hand. She looked at it, then placed hers in his. Warm, solid, present. And for the first time in 42 minutes, she didn't feel like the world was collapsing. She felt still, held. When they walked down that aisle together, the gasps were audible. Guests froze mid-sip, heads turned, cameras lowered. But Grace didn't hear any of it. She only heard her footsteps and his beside hers. And when they stopped before the officiant, and he turned to look at her, there was something in Cole's eyes that shook her more than the abandonment ever could. Because it wasn't blank, it wasn't detached. It was intensely aware of her, of the moment, of something no one else seemed to understand yet. The ceremony moved forward in a blur, words, vows, nods, rings. And when he said, "I do," Grace almost forgot she wasn't supposed to believe it. The kiss was brief, barely a breath against her lips, but it stayed with her long after they turned to face the crowd. Applause broke through the confusion. People cheered, nervous, polite, stunned. And still, Grace couldn't let go of the way Cole held her hand, like it wasn't part of the act, like he had waited for this moment. Not hours, but years. The applause still echoed in Grace's ears like a ghost. Polite, confused, obligatory. She and Cole stood at the center of the ballroom, framed by flickering candles and towering floral arrangements that now seemed like they belonged to someone else's dream, someone else's life. Her hand still rested in his. Not out of affection, not yet, but because letting go too soon might cause everything to fall apart, might reveal the truth she hadn't even fully processed yet. They were married, by law, by witnesses, by vow. Grace Sullivan had become Grace Blake, and yet she didn't even know the man beside her well enough to ask what kind of music he liked. The officiant had left. The guests had begun murmuring again, whispers mixing with jazz from the quartet in the far corner. Cole leaned down slightly and whispered close to her ear, "There's a room upstairs where you can catch your breath. You don't owe anyone explanations." His voice was low, steady, almost kind. Not a question. An offer. She nodded wordlessly, her throat too tight to speak. As they made their way through the maze of startled faces, Grace caught snippets, gasps, smiles laced with speculation, and more than one phone discreetly raised to capture the moment. Let them wonder. Let them try to make sense of it. She couldn't. Not yet. When they reached the grand staircase, Cole gestured for her to go first, keeping a respectful distance, and that alone surprised her. No pressure, no claim, just quiet presence. The room upstairs was dimly lit, with velvet drapes and a faint scent of lavender in the air. As she stepped inside, Cole stayed at the threshold. "I'll give you space," he said simply. "Wait." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but he stopped immediately. She turned slowly. "Why did you really do it?" His eyes didn't flinch. "Because I couldn't watch you be humiliated like that." That's not an answer. He took a breath, and for the first time she saw it, the faintest flicker of something behind the mask. Not guilt, not pride. Something softer. "I've been watching you long before today. Not in a creepy way," he added quickly, sensing her sudden shift. "Just quietly, from a distance, admiring your work, your strength." She blinked. "You've seen my art? All of it?" Grace's pulse stuttered. She hadn't even realized he knew she was an artist. Lucas had barely shown any interest. Cole shifted his weight, as if suddenly uncomfortable with being this exposed. "You can rest here as long as you need. I'll be downstairs. When you're ready, we'll leave." She nodded again, but her mind was a storm of questions, with no safe place to land. An hour later, the car ride was silent. Cole sat beside her in the back of a black town car, eyes fixed on the city lights. The ring on her finger felt foreign, too tight, as though it didn't belong to her hand. Or maybe it wasn't the ring. Maybe it was the weight of what it symbolized. She had married a stranger, but then again, hadn't Lucas become a stranger long before he left her at the altar? Cole finally broke the silence. I have a penthouse in Manhattan. You're welcome to stay there. It's private, secure, no press. And what are we telling people? That we eloped. Sudden, impulsive, romantic. Her laugh came out dry. Romantic? He turned toward her. If it helps them believe it, let them. The car pulled up to a modern high-rise wrapped in glass and steel. A doorman opened the door as if nothing unusual had happened, as if brides entered here in wedding gowns every day. The elevator ride was quiet again, but this time not uncomfortably so. When the doors opened, she stepped into a space that felt more like a museum than a home. Clean lines, muted tones, large abstract paintings. Cold, beautiful, immaculate, just like him. He walked ahead, then paused, as if remembering she didn't know her way. There's a guest room down the hall. Fresh clothes are being sent up. Tomorrow, I'll take you somewhere more peaceful. She tilted her head. Why? Because you need time to breathe, and this city won't give it to you. She didn't respond. Didn't know how to. Instead, she walked to the window, looking down at the pulse of Manhattan far below. So many people, so much noise. And yet, in this moment, everything felt unnervingly still. He spoke again, softer this time. I won't touch you, Grace. This marriage, it doesn't have to mean anything you're not ready for. She turned sharply. I didn't think it would. He nodded. Just wanted you to hear it from me. For a second, she searched his face, looking for cracks, looking for an agenda. But there was only honesty. Maybe guarded, maybe too measured, but honest nonetheless. She stepped away from the window and moved toward the hallway where he had pointed. Before disappearing into the guest room, she paused. Thank you, she said quietly. Cole didn't smile. He just inclined his head and watched her go. But when she closed the door behind her, her heart wouldn't stop pounding. And she didn't know if it was from fear or something else entirely. The next morning, sunlight poured through tall windows. Grace stood barefoot on the balcony, wrapped in a robe too luxurious for comfort. Her coffee steamed in her hands. Down below, the city was waking. Behind her, footsteps. She didn't turn. Cole's voice reached her gently. I have a house in Vermont, by the lake. It's quiet, private. I thought we could go there for a few days, until the noise fades. And after that, you can go back to your life, or not. She turned now, facing him. What happens between us, Cole? He didn't answer right away. Then, simply, that's up to you. She searched his face for a sign, a crack in the armor. Instead, she found something else. He wasn't offering her a prison. He was offering her a pause, a chance. And for the first time in a long time, Grace realized she didn't want to escape this just yet. She wanted to see where it might go, but she didn't say it. Not yet. The car moved slowly through the winding Vermont roads, climbing higher into a landscape of pine trees, silent lakes, and distant mountains veiled in mist. Grace sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, her wedding dress long since replaced by a soft gray sweater borrowed from Cole's apartment. They hadn't spoken much since leaving Manhattan that morning. There were words, of course, polite, clear, efficient, but not the kind that touched skin or stirred the air between two people, just arrangements, directions, logistics. And yet, Grace couldn't stop noticing the way Cole drove, calm, focused, like someone who wasn't escaping anything, but rather leading them towards something he had already made peace with. She hadn't asked why Vermont. She hadn't needed to. Silence, solitude, distance. It was exactly what her bruised heart craved, even if she didn't yet know how to heal it. After nearly 4 hours, the car curved into a narrow private road that opened into a clearing surrounded by woods. There, nestled by the lake, stood a house made of stone and cedar, modern but earthy, like it belonged to the land. Grace exhaled slowly. It was breathtaking. Cole glanced at her but didn't speak. He parked, stepped out, walked around, and opened her door with quiet ceremony. She stepped onto gravel, the air crisp and clean, smelling of pine, smoke, and something faintly sweet, maybe maple. Inside, the house was warm and filled with amber light. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the lake. A fireplace crackled in the living room. The furniture was minimal but deeply comfortable, as though every object had been chosen not for style, but for silence. "This was my mother's favorite place," Cole said, his voice quiet as he set their bags down. "She used to say this was where the noise stopped." Grace looked at him surprised. "I didn't know your mother passed." "When I was 17. A pause stretched between them, not awkward, just real. She nodded, acknowledging the weight of his words without pressing further. Cole gestured toward a hallway. "There are 2 bedrooms. I'll take the one upstairs. You can have the one by the lake view. You didn't have to bring me here," she said softly. He looked at her, and for a moment she saw something flicker, something unspoken like regret or restraint. "I know." And then he walked away. The next morning, Grace awoke to birdsong and sunlight spilling across the wooden floor. She stretched beneath soft linen sheets and listened to the sound of waves lapping gently against the shore. For a brief moment, she forgot why she was there, forgot the headlines, the whispers, the scandal, and then it all returned like a wave. She wandered into the kitchen barefoot, finding a pot of coffee already brewed. Cole stood by the counter, dressed simply in jeans and a dark sweater, barefoot as well. He handed her a mug without a word. They sipped in silence. Grace noticed the art on the walls. Not generic prints, but paintings. Real ones. Some looked like local landscapes. Others were more abstract. One piece, hanging above the fireplace, stopped her in her tracks. "I know this artist," she whispered. Cole turned. "You should. It's yours." Her breath hitched. It was a piece she had sold anonymously 3 years ago, part of a tiny gallery exhibit in Brooklyn that hardly anyone attended. She had never known who bought it. "You bought this?" He nodded once. "It was the first time I saw your work. I stood there for nearly an hour watching people pass by without seeing what I saw." "And what did you see?" she asked quietly. He met her gaze. A soul trying to survive. Grace lowered her eyes, feeling suddenly stripped bare. "I built a studio here for her," he added. She looked up. "For your wife," he clarified. "Back when I thought it would be someone else. But I always hoped, someday, it would be you." The words landed softly but left tremors. They didn't speak again for hours. Later that afternoon, rain began to fall, tapping gently against the windows. Grace wandered through the house until she found the studio. It wasn't just a room, it was a sanctuary. Large windows, tall ceilings, shelves lined with brushes and pigments, canvases stacked neatly, a stool by the window, a sink with clay bowls, a faint scent of linseed oil and cedar. She stood in the center of it and let herself breathe for the first time in days. It wasn't just that the space was beautiful, it was that it felt like someone had listened to her without her ever speaking. Every detail mirrored something she hadn't dared ask for. That night after dinner, simple pasta, wine, quiet music, Cole offered to light the fireplace. Grace nodded, curling into one of the armchairs with a blanket over her knees. The fire cast golden shadows on the walls, flickering like a heartbeat. "You didn't answer me," she said after a long pause. He looked up. "When I asked what you saw in that painting," his voice came softer now. "I saw a woman trying to hold herself together with color. I saw longing. I saw strength beneath grief. And I saw something I couldn't stop thinking about." She swallowed. "And now," he hesitated, "now I see you." Their eyes locked, and in that moment, something unspoken began to unravel. The days blurred gently together. In the morning, Grace painted. In the afternoons, they walked along the lake or sat on the porch sipping tea. At night, they often ended up in the living room, sometimes talking, sometimes not. There were no declarations, no touches, no plans. Just presence. And the slow, quiet shifting of something that felt less like arrangement and more like alignment. One evening, she found herself laughing, truly laughing, at something he said about an investor who once mistook a sculpture for a coat rack. Cole looked startled by the sound at first and then enchanted. "You should laugh more," he said. "You should try giving people more reasons to," she replied. He smiled. Rare. Real. That night, as they each prepared for bed, Grace paused outside his door. She didn't knock, didn't speak, but for the first time she wondered what it would feel like to let the door open. One morning, she walked into the kitchen to find breakfast already waiting. Fresh croissants, strawberries, scrambled eggs with rosemary. She raised an eyebrow. "You cook?" Cole looked slightly sheepish. "I read a book once." "Which one?" He shrugged. "Something French." The title was pretentious. She laughed again, and something in the room shifted. Grace stepped closer, reached for a strawberry, and their hands touched. Brief, but something electric passed between them. She looked up, and he was already watching her. The silence swelled. Not awkward, not confusing, just charged. And it lingered, long after she walked away. Later that afternoon, as golden light filtered through the studio windows, Grace stood before a canvas, brush in hand, unsure what to paint. Then she closed her eyes and didn't think. She felt. And before she realized it, the strokes began. Soft at first, then bold. Colors she hadn't touched in months flowed from her fingers. She didn't know what she was painting, only that it was real, raw, hers. When she finally stepped back hours later, the light had changed, and Cole stood silently at the doorway. He didn't speak. He didn't compliment. He just looked, and that look said everything. That night, neither of them could sleep. The storm outside rattled the windows. Thunder cracked above the lake like the sky had something to say and had waited too long to say it. Grace stood in the hallway in her robe, drawn to the sound of the rain. She found him by the fire, a book in his hands, unread. He looked up. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered. "Me neither." She stepped closer. He didn't move, didn't speak. And then, very slowly, she sat beside him. Their shoulders touched. And for a long moment, the storm outside was the only thing moving. But inside, something had just begun. The lake shimmered under the early morning sun, its surface like brushed silver, as Grace stepped barefoot into the studio, coffee in hand. The air smelled faintly of cedar and turpentine. Light poured in through the tall windows, wrapping the room in a golden hush. She hadn't planned to paint today. Her body was sore from long hours on her feet, her mind still tangled in yesterday's quiet tension. But something in the light, something in the stillness that pulled her toward the easel. As she mixed her colors, her thoughts drifted. She found herself thinking not just about her own work, but about Cole. How his silences weren't cold, but curated, measured, like he was always protecting something fragile inside him. And then she saw it, barely noticeable, half covered beneath a beige dropcloth in the corner of the studio. Another easel. But this one didn't belong to her. Curious, she crossed the room, set her mug on the shelf, and pulled the cloth aside gently. A painting, but not one of hers. It was a portrait, unfinished, soft brush strokes, rough outlines, a woman's back facing the viewer, standing at a window. The lines were graceful, hesitant, like someone painting from memory rather than reference. She stepped closer, her hair, her shape, her posture. It was her. Before she could stop herself, her breath caught. And at that precise moment, a voice came from behind her. "I didn't mean for you to find that yet." She turned. Cole stood at the doorway, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on the floor. "You painted this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded once. "I didn't even know you painted." "I don't. Not like you. It's just something I try sometimes, when I can't sleep." Grace looked back at the canvas. "You've been trying to paint me." "No," he said quietly. "I've been trying to understand you." She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at the image of herself on the canvas. Familiar, yet strange. Like someone had captured not her appearance, but her solitude. "How long have you been working on this?" she asked. "Since the first night you arrived." She blinked. but you barely looked at me." I saw more than I let on. Silence settled between them again, but this time it felt warmer, like a blanket drawn gently between two people, still afraid to admit they were cold. "I thought I was invisible," she said, almost to herself. "You were never invisible to me." She turned slowly to face him, the weight of his words pressing into the space between them. And then, without warning, he walked toward the shelf, pulled open a drawer, and handed her a folder. "This was meant for later, but you're already here." Grace opened it slowly. Blueprints, architectural sketches, handwritten notes in a neat slanted hand, the layout of the studio she was standing in. But something else caught her eye, dates in the margins. The earliest was nearly 8 months ago. She looked up sharply. "You started planning this when I was still engaged to Lucas." He met her eyes steady. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I knew he wouldn't see you." Her heart thudded, slow and heavy. "I went to one of your early shows, the one in the basement gallery on Mercer Street. No one noticed you." "Not really, but I did. You were standing in the corner, alone next to your piece, the one with the child in the open window." Her eyes widened. "No one ever remembered that one," she whispered. "I did," he said, "because I remember how you looked at it, like you had put something there that you couldn't say out loud." Grace swallowed hard. "I knew I couldn't approach you then. You were attached to a version of the future that didn't include me, and I wasn't looking for anything either. I just started building this place for someone like you, for you." She let out a slow, trembling breath. "It wasn't obsession," he added quickly, sensing her inner conflict. "I didn't follow you. I didn't interfere. I just hoped." Grace lowered her gaze, overwhelmed. A man who barely knew her had built her a sanctuary, while the one who claimed to love her hadn't even asked how her art made her feel. She turned, stepping into the center of the room. "You planned all this, but didn't expect me to ever see it." "I didn't expect you to choose me." "I didn't." He paused. "You chose not to fall," he said softly. "But you were already slipping, and maybe I just caught you." Her eyes met his, raw, searching. "Do you still want me here?" she asked. "I want you where you feel seen." The answer struck her deeper than she expected. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire from the main room beyond. And then, slowly, she crossed to the canvas again, studied the unfinished version of herself, and without turning around said, "Leave it unfinished." He stepped forward. "Why?" "Because maybe it's still becoming." He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded. Later that evening, after she had spent hours in the studio lost in color, Grace found herself sitting on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The lake was still. The stars were beginning to scatter across the sky like quiet witnesses. Cole stepped out with 2 mugs of tea. He handed her one. Sat beside her. No words this time. Just warmth and closeness. She felt the side of his arm brush hers. "I don't know what this is," she said softly. "Neither do I. But I'm not afraid of it." He turned to her. "Good." Then silence again. But this time it wasn't avoidance. It was agreement. When she finally stood to return inside, she paused at the door, turned back to him, and said something she hadn't planned. "I think I'm ready to start over." He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't try to define it. He just nodded and followed her inside. But that night, as she lay in bed, her mind replayed his words. "I saw more than I let on." And she wondered, what else had he seen in her that she still didn't see in herself? The days moved like brushstrokes, soft, deliberate, full of pauses that meant more than words ever could. In the silence of the lake house, something between them shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. Grace felt it in the way Cole looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, how his gaze lingered a moment longer each day, how his voice grew quieter when they were alone, how he always seemed to know exactly when to step closer and when not to. She felt it in herself too, in the way she waited for his footsteps in the hallway, the way her pulse reacted when he entered the room, the way her body leaned ever so slightly toward him, without thought, without permission. It wasn't dramatic, it was awakening. One evening, Rain fell steadily outside, soaking the wooden porch and streaking the tall windows. They sat across from each other in the living room, the fire casting golden shadow across their faces. Grace sipped wine. Cole was reading, but not really. She could tell by the way his eyes hadn't moved across the page in 10 minutes. She set her glass down. "You said you built the studio for someone like me," she said quietly. He looked up. "But it's more than that, isn't it?" He didn't answer right away. Then, with disarming honesty, "Yes." Grace stood slowly, walking to the window. The rain was steady, like a heartbeat. She pressed her hand gently to the cold glass. "I've been trying to understand what this is," she said. "What we are." Cole rose but didn't come closer. He waited. "I told myself this marriage was just a shield," she continued. "A way to survive the disaster. But it doesn't feel like that anymore." She turned to face him. "It feels like something I wasn't ready for." His eyes didn't flinch. "I never wanted to corner you into anything," he said. "That's why I kept distance. Why I waited." "Waited for what?" "For you to stop looking behind you." Her chest rose sharply, because he was right. She had been waiting for Lucas's shadow to disappear, waiting for her old life to dissolve. But it hadn't. It had only gone quiet, lingering like a ghost in her thoughts. Until now. "I'm still afraid," she admitted. "So am I." And in that shared confession, something broke open between them. He crossed the room slowly, as if each step asked permission. When he reached her, he didn't touch her, just stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. His eyes searched hers, not for answers, just for truth. "You're allowed to feel everything," he said softly. "The grief, the desire, the doubt. None of it makes you weak." Her breath trembled. He reached for her hand, slow, reverent, and when his fingers closed around hers, it wasn't possession, it was grounding. Her voice was barely audible. "I don't know what to do with this." "You don't have to know, you just have to let it happen." She let out a shaky breath, then stepped into him, not dramatically, not like in stories, but quietly, like surrender. His arms circled her waist. Hers slid up around his neck. Their bodies pressed together like puzzle pieces, finally daring to belong. He rested his forehead against hers. "Tell me to stop, and I will." She didn't. She tilted her head and kissed him. At first, it was cautious, just the whisper of mouths learning each other's rhythm. But then it deepened. His hand moved gently to her back. Her fingers found the collar of his shirt. The kiss grew bolder, slower, then softer again, like they were breathing each other in. It wasn't lust. It was reverence. They parted only slightly, just enough to look at one another. His thumb grazed the side of her jaw. "You feel like a beginning," he whispered. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she let go. The bedroom was dim, lit only by the fireplace flickering low in the corner. Outside, thunder rolled across the lake, but inside, everything was still. They undressed slowly, not hurried, not hesitant, but with quiet ceremony. Each layer removed was a layer of armor shed, not just from the body, but from memory, from fear. When he laid her down, he didn't rush. He didn't conquer. He discovered. His hands moved with care, not claiming territory, but honoring it. Her breath caught in places she didn't know could hold longing. Her body responded with both curiosity and gratitude, and when he kissed her again, everywhere, it felt like a language only they could speak. She traced the lines of his chest, the curve of his shoulder, the vulnerability in his eyes. He was strong, yes, but he was also tender, unafraid to be slow, unafraid to wait, unafraid to worship, and she let him, fully, without defense, without apology. The night was a blur of warmth, of quiet gasps, of hands and mouths and hearts finding rhythm. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about being, together. Hours later, Grace lay against his chest, his hand moving lazily up and down her back. Neither of them had spoken in a while. The rain had stopped. Only the crackling fire remained. She stared at the ceiling, her heart calm but full, "What now?" she asked softly. He exhaled against her hair. "Whatever you want." She looked up at him. "You mean that?" "I mean that." She touched his face, the faint stubble along his jaw. "I don't want to pretend anymore." "Then don't." Silence again. But this one was rich, full, electric with what had been said, and more importantly, what hadn't. She nestled into him again. And somewhere between the hush of the fire and the slow, steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her ear, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. But deep in the night, long after he had fallen asleep, Grace sat up quietly in the bed, pulled the blanket around her, and stared out the window. The lake reflected moonlight now, calm and still. Her thoughts, however, had begun to stir again, because now that she had given in to this, there was something she couldn't stop wondering. Had she surrendered to something real, or just built another dream she didn't yet know how to wake from? The rain had passed, but its memory lingered in the scent of wet pine and the softness of the earth beneath their feet. The air was cool and damp, the lake a sheet of pale glass stretching out in silence. Grace stood by the water's edge, the hem of her dress brushing against her calves, toes buried in the cold sand. Cole watched her from the porch, arms crossed loosely, a cup of black coffee in one hand. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She turned to him slowly, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face bare, calm. "I don't remember the last time I felt like I belonged somewhere." He took a sip, still watching her. "Maybe you never did. Until now." The words weren't meant to be grand, but they landed somewhere deep inside her, somewhere fragile, somewhere still healing. She walked back toward the house, barefoot, brushing against tall grass, the smell of wet bark rising from the woods around them. When she reached the steps, he handed her the cup. She took it. Warmth seeped into her hands. "Do you always say things like that?" she asked. He raised a brow. "Like what?" "Like you see more than you're supposed to." A faint smile touched his lips. "Only when someone's trying to hide." That afternoon they took a rowboat out onto the lake. The water was so still it barely made a sound beneath them. Grace leaned back with her face tilted toward the sun, her fingers trailing in the water. Cole rowed in silence, his movements rhythmic, unhurried. "You were quiet this morning," she said without opening her eyes. "You were painting," he answered. "I didn't want to interrupt." She opened one eye to look at him. "You're good at that." "At interrupting?" "At giving space." He met her gaze. "And you're good at pretending you're fine when you're unraveling." She let out a soft laugh, surprised at how accurate he was. "Have you always watched people like this?" "I don't watch people. I watch you." Silence filled the space between them. Not tension, not discomfort. Something else. Understanding. She closed her eyes again. "You make it hard to hide." "Good," he said. That evening, they cooked together. It started awkwardly. Two people trying to move in the same small kitchen space, reaching for spoons at the same time, bumping elbows. But then came the laughter, the kind that comes when you stop pretending, the kind that comes when something starts to feel real. She burned the garlic. He dropped the wine opener into the pot, and when the pasta finally made it to the table, it was overcooked and clumpy, but neither of them cared. They ate with their legs tucked up in chairs, sipping wine, telling stories, not the rehearsed kind they told at dinners and events, but real ones, about childhood fears and favorite books, about scars that didn't show, and moments that had changed everything. "I was 16 when I stopped painting," Cole said, twirling his fork. "I had this art teacher who told me I lacked perspective, that I was too detached, that I didn't feel enough to create something meaningful." Grace looked at him, surprised. "That's cruel." "It was true back then anyway. I didn't feel much of anything, not until later." "Later when?" He didn't answer, but his eyes were on her, and she understood. After dinner, they sat on the porch in silence, watching the sky bleed from gold into lavender. Crickets began to hum in the trees. The lake darkened slowly, stars beginning to prick the sky above it. Cole leaned back in the chair, one ankle resting over his knee, hands behind his head. "You know, when I built this house, I thought I was building it for solitude, a place to escape the world. And now I think I was building it to meet myself." She turned to him, studying his profile in the fading light. "And who are you?" He paused, then turned to her, Someone who wants to stop running. She didn't respond, because that answer, simple as it was, felt like the most honest thing he'd ever said. Later that night, Grace wandered into the studio, drawn by the scent of paint and the soft creaking of the floorboards under her steps. The space was lit only by the moonlight pouring through the windows, casting blue shadows across the walls. She sat at the stool, pulled a canvas toward her and began to paint, not with a plan, not with fear, but with feeling. And for the first time in months, she didn't hesitate. Brush met canvas like it was meeting skin. Each stroke, a memory. Each layer, a confession. When she heard the door creak behind her, she didn't stop. She knew it was him. He didn't speak, just watched. And when she finally set the brush down, she turned to him and asked, "Do you ever wish things had happened differently?" He stepped into the moonlight, face calm. "Sometimes, but then I look at where we are now, and I think maybe everything happened exactly the way it had to." She looked at the painting again. It wasn't a portrait. It wasn't abstract. It was a feeling, grief and hope tangled into color. "You're not detached," she whispered. He stepped closer. "Neither are you." Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the entire world shrank to a single breath between them. The next morning, they woke, wrapped in each other, the sheets tangled, sunlight sneaking through the curtains. No words were exchanged at first, just slow movements, quiet smiles, the intimacy of shared silence. Grace wandered into the kitchen and found Cole already making breakfast, humming some unfamiliar melody under his breath. "You hum now?" she teased. He looked up. "Only on days I survive your cooking." She rolled her eyes and grabbed an apple from the counter. "So, yesterday was a near-death experience," he shrugged. "Close enough." They ate on the porch again, the lake still and silver in the early light. After breakfast, he pulled out an old chessboard from a cabinet. "You play?" he asked. "Only when I want to lose." "Perfect. I love winning." They played for over an hour. He was annoyingly good. She was frustratingly distracted. But she didn't mind losing, not to him. Not like this. Not when laughter and glances and accidental touches had become part of the game. Later, as they walked the trail behind the house, barefoot and slow, Grace felt something shift inside her. Not a decision, not a plan, just a quiet knowing that she was no longer in transition. She was becoming. They stopped near a clearing, where sunlight dappled through the trees. She turned to him. "You asked me once who I was painting for," she said. "I remember. I think now. I'm painting for myself." He smiled. "That's all I ever wanted you to do." And yet, that night, as she stood by the window of her bedroom, watching the wind ripple across the water, a strange unease settled in her chest. Because peace, true peace, often felt unfamiliar when you've lived in survival too long. And deep down a whisper began to stir. How long can something this beautiful last before the world comes looking for it? The sound of tires on wet pavement echoed against the concrete buildings as the black SUV turned the final corner into Manhattan. Grace sat quietly in the back seat, forehead resting against the cool window, watching as the trees and glass of Vermont gave way to steel, sirens, and shadows. New York hadn't changed, but she had. The city still moved at the same impossible pace, the same blur of strangers on sidewalks, the same horns blaring for no reason and every reason. But Grace no longer felt like one of them. Not entirely. She hadn't spoken much since they crossed the state line. Neither had Cole. They both knew something delicate had been growing between them in that quiet house by the lake. Something fragile, unnamed. And now, the city threatened to steal it away. When the car pulled into the underground garage of the penthouse, Grace stepped out slowly. Her heels clicked against the concrete floor with a sound that used to feel empowering. Now it just sounded loud, hollow. Cole reached for her bag, but she stopped him. "I've got it." He paused, then nodded. "I'll order dinner." She nodded back and followed him into the elevator. The silence between them wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was something in between. A waiting room. A breath held. That evening the penthouse felt different, colder, too pristine, too aware of itself. Grace stood barefoot in the hallway, watching as Cole typed something into his phone. Room service, probably. Or business. Always business. She opened the door to the guest room, her room, and found everything exactly as it had been, as if she had never left, as if Vermont had been a dream she'd sketched in her mind and tucked away in some drawer. She sat on the bed, took a long breath, then heard it. A knock. Soft, hesitant. She opened the door to find a delivery man holding a bouquet of pale roses. The card was tucked between two stems. She didn't need to read it, but she did. "I'm sorry. You were never supposed to get hurt. Please meet me. Lucas." Her stomach clenched. Her fingers trembled. She dropped the card on the bed, walked down the hallway, and placed the flowers directly into the trash bin beneath the kitchen island. Cole was leaning against the counter, watching her. "From him?" She nodded. He didn't ask what the message said. He didn't need to. But his jaw tightened. Not from jealousy, from something deeper. Fear, maybe. Or foresight. Later that night, they sat together on the couch, a glass of wine between them. Grace curled her legs under her body, her sweater slipping off one shoulder. She hadn't said much since the roses. Neither had he. "I don't know what he wants," she said finally. Cole took a sip of his wine. "I do." She turned to him. "What does that mean?" "He wants back what he gave up, or worse, he wants to remind you that he still has access to your attention." She didn't answer, because part of her knew Cole was right. But another part hated how easily he'd spoken the words, like Lucas's presence still had the power to move her. She rose abruptly. "I'm going to bed." Grace. But she didn't wait. The next morning, she found the studio empty, her brushes untouched. She tried to paint. Tried to drown the thoughts in color, but her hands didn't cooperate. Her focus kept drifting to that single line in the card. "You were never supposed to get hurt." Like she was collateral, like her pain had been inevitable. She left the apartment mid-afternoon without telling Cole. Just needed air, noise, something that didn't smell like memory. Wandered downtown, walked through a small gallery, saw works by strangers that felt more like mirrors than art. She stayed until closing time. When she returned, the doorman handed her a note. "Vanessa Carlyle stopped by. Said she'll wait until you're ready to talk." Her blood chilled. Vanessa. The name alone was enough to twist her stomach into knots. Cole's former flame, powerful, charismatic, public. The kind of woman who spoke in headlines and moved through rooms like she owned the oxygen. Grace climbed the elevator slowly, dreading the conversation she knew was coming. And it didn't take long. Vanessa arrived the next day. Unannounced, elegant as ever, red lips, black heels, intent in her eyes. "I'll be quick," she said, stepping into the living room without being invited. "I'm not here to fight, just to remind you of a few truths before you lose yourself completely." Grace crossed her arms. "I don't think I asked for reminders." Vanessa smiled, thin and sharp. "No one ever does." She walked slowly toward the bookshelf, trailing her fingers along the spines. "Did he tell you how many women he's tried to save before? How many he's collected like broken art pieces needing restoration?" Grace's heart pounded. "You don't know me." "No," Vanessa said, turning around. "But I know him, and I know how he works. Silent, strategic, sweet enough to make you forget that everything he offers comes with conditions." Grace's mouth went dry. "Be careful," Vanessa said, "because men like Cole, they don't fall in love. They recruit." And then she left, without waiting for a response. That night, Grace confronted him, not with accusations, but with silence. He stepped into the studio and found her sitting in the dark. "Vanessa came by," she said flatly. He closed the door behind him. "I figured she would. She said you collect broken people." "I don't. She said you never fall in love." He paused. That part might have been true once. And now the question hung in the air between them like smoke. He stepped closer. "I've never met anyone who made me want to stop protecting myself until you." Her eyes searched his. "I don't want to be another one of your projects, Cole." "You're not. Then prove it." He hesitated, and in that moment, That one hesitation, her heart broke just enough to doubt everything. She didn't sleep that night. Not because of Vanessa, not because of Lucas, but because of the crack in his answer. The pause where certainty should have lived. And just before dawn, as the city began to hum again, Grace found herself looking at the ring on her finger. Simple, elegant, heavy. Was it protection? Or was it possession? She didn't know anymore. The next morning, a knock echoed through the apartment. A familiar knock. Lucas, standing there, suit pressed, eyes softer than she remembered. "I don't want to cause trouble," he said. "I just want to tell you something before someone else twists the story." She didn't invite him in, but she didn't close the door either. "I know about the investigator Cole hired," he said. "I know he's been watching you for over a year. I have the reports." Her blood turned cold. "What? He tracked you, Grace. Long before the wedding. He knew things. He orchestrated things." "Why would you show me this now?" she asked, voice shaking. "Because you deserve to know whether this was fate or calculation." She closed the door in his face. But the damage had already entered. And when she turned and saw Cole standing at the end of the hallway, silent, eyes unreadable, she knew. Something had changed. Grace didn't say anything for a long time. She just stood in the hallway, the folder still in her hands, its contents pressing like ice against her chest. She hadn't opened it, didn't need to. Lucas's words already echoed loud enough to crack something inside her. Cole leaned against the doorway of the studio, arms crossed, gaze steady, but unreadable. "You hired someone to follow me?" she asked, her voice quieter than she expected. He didn't answer right away, and that silence, that single hesitation, was louder than any confession. "I needed to know you were safe," he finally said. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" Her voice cracked, not with anger, but disbelief. "Because it feels a lot like obsession." His jaw tightened. "It wasn't." "Then say it. Out loud. Tell me why." He stepped forward, slowly, controlled, but she stepped back. And that too said something neither of them could undo. "I saw Lucas spiraling months before the wedding," he said. "The gambling, the late-night calls, the lies. I didn't trust him, and I didn't trust what he might do to you." She blinked hard. "So instead of warning me, you followed me?" "No. I watched out for you." Grace shook her head, stepping farther back. "That's not what it felt like. That's not what this feels like. I didn't plan the wedding falling apart. I didn't expect to be the one standing at the altar. But you were ready for it," she said, eyes narrowing. "You were prepared." He froze, and there it was. The look, that flicker of guilt he couldn't disguise. "Did you know he would leave me?" she asked, breathless. "No," he said softly, "but I knew it was a possibility." She stared at him, her heart thudding in her ears. "And when he did," she whispered, "you stepped in. I wanted to protect you. You wanted to possess me." "No." His voice was firmer now. "I wanted to rewrite the ending you didn't deserve." She closed her eyes, the weight of his words too much. "You don't get to decide that," she said, barely audible. She walked past him, into the guest room, closed the door behind her with trembling fingers, and for the first time since the wedding, she cried. Not like someone breaking, but like someone being forced to rewrite the truth she had been clinging to. The next morning, the city was wrapped in clouds. Muted light spilled across the hardwood floors. Grace stood in the kitchen, staring at a half-filled mug of coffee she hadn't touched. Cole entered quietly. No tie, no armor. Just a man caught between two truths. "I know you don't trust me right now," he said. She didn't look at him. He stepped closer. "But everything I did, it wasn't to manipulate you." "No," she said, finally turning. "Then what was it?" "To make sure you didn't end up living a lie, like my mother did." Her expression faltered. "What?" He exhaled slowly. "My father, he wasn't loyal. He gave her the perfect life, on paper. But behind the curtains, there were always shadows. I watched her shrink for years, pretend, smile, host parties with her heart breaking in silence. Grace softened, if only for a moment. She told me once, he continued, never let someone call it love if it only protects their image. He paused. So when I saw what Lucas was turning into, I couldn't let history repeat itself. But I'm not your mother, she said. No, he said gently. You're the first woman I ever wanted to be honest with. She stared at him, 1,000 emotions colliding in her chest. And yet, the pain lingered, because intentions didn't erase betrayal. That afternoon, Grace sat in her studio, brush in hand, but the canvas remained blank. Her thoughts were too loud, her heart too fractured. She wanted to forgive, to understand. But something in her had closed, just enough to feel the difference. She walked to the bookshelf and pulled out an old sketch pad. Flipping through the pages, she landed on a piece she'd drawn weeks ago. A woman, mid-stride, walking into fog, alone. That evening she told Cole she needed space, not forever, but for now. I'm going back to Brooklyn, she said, voice calm, to my grandmother's old place, just for a few days. He nodded, slowly. Okay. He didn't fight it, didn't beg, but the way he looked at her, as if she were already leaving for good, left her shaken. He walked her to the elevator, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. And just before the doors closed, she said, If you want me to come back, don't follow me. He met her eyes. I won't. The doors closed. And Grace felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Freedom and loneliness. All at once. That night, in the small, cluttered house in Brooklyn, she sat on the floor of her grandmother's room, surrounded by old paintings, books, and unfinished projects. The scent of lavender still lingered in the walls. The creak of the floorboards was familiar. She felt like herself again, or at least someone she used to be. She lit a candle, opened the windows, let the city hum around her. And in that quiet, she asked herself a question she hadn't dared before. Did I fall for Cole because he saw me, or because I wanted someone to rescue me? The answer didn't come that night, but the silence felt closer to truth than anything she'd heard in weeks. The old house in Brooklyn smelled of dust, lavender, and oil paint. Grace stood in the narrow hallway with her suitcase at her feet, the key still in the lock behind her. The lights were dim, the silence was vast. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She walked slowly through the rooms, her fingers grazing familiar doorframes. The wood creaked beneath her steps, not like the smooth silence of Cole's penthouse, but with memory, with presence. This was where she had first learned to draw, where her grandmother used to braid her hair in the kitchen while the world burned outside. Where no one demanded she be anything other than exactly what she was. And now, she was here again, alone, by choice. She left her suitcase unopened and sat on the floor of the living room. The rug was faded, the windows fogged, but her body relaxed in a way it hadn't in weeks. She didn't need answers here, only breath. The first night, she slept without dreams. No images of Vermont, no flashbacks of the wedding, no glimpses of Cole's eyes, only darkness. And for the first time in what felt like forever, it felt like peace. In the mornings, she opened all the windows, letting the breeze carry in city sounds, sirens, music, voices in Spanish, and laughter from children playing on the sidewalk. She drank coffee, curled on the fire escape. She walked barefoot across the chipped kitchen tiles. And she painted, not because she had to, but because she couldn't not. Her hands moved before her thoughts did. The brush dipped, lifted, glided, paused. There was no plan, just impulse, color, rhythm. She painted herself standing in rain. She painted a man standing in a hallway, face half lit, unsure whether to enter or leave. She painted a heartbeat made of glass. She didn't name them. She didn't have to. Sometimes she thought about calling him Cole. But then she would remember the look on his face when she asked him not to follow her, and how he obeyed, not because he stopped caring, but because he understood that real love doesn't chase what needs to be still. A week passed, then 10 days, no calls, no messages. And strangely, that silence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like respect, but it didn't make the ache go away. One afternoon she found her grandmother's old cassette player, still working, still full of half-erased mixtapes. She pressed play. Jazz, low and crackling, filled the living room. She sat by the window, knees pulled to her chest, watching the world move outside. Two boys played soccer in the alley. A woman across the street argued with someone on the phone. A dog barked at a pigeon like it was the end of the world. It was all so ordinary, and yet Grace felt like she was watching life from behind glass, because something inside her still lived elsewhere. Still remembered how Cole's hand fit against her back when he didn't think she noticed. Still remembered the way his voice sounded at night, lower, less guarded, almost vulnerable. Still remembered what it felt like to be chosen, not because she was perfect, but because she was real. She closed her eyes and whispered to no one, "I don't know what to do with that." She started going to the little bodega on the corner every morning, just like her grandmother used to. The owner, Miguel, still remembered her. "You're the artist," he said, placing oranges into a brown paper bag. "I used to be," she replied. He frowned. "Once you see the world that way, you can't unsee it." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm trying to see it again." At night she lit candles, not for mood, not for atmosphere, but to remember the softness of quiet. She would sit in the middle of the studio, surrounded by canvases half finished, and ask herself questions she hadn't dared when she was with Cole. What did I want from him? What did I give without knowing? And what part of me is still afraid of being fully seen? The answers didn't come all at once, but pieces did. Memories of her childhood, of needing to earn love through achievement. Memories of Lucas, how she had excused his absence by calling it ambition. Memories of herself, quiet, hidden, waiting to be found. She stopped counting the days. Until one morning she woke to a letter slipped under her door. No name, no return address, just a handwritten note. "I haven't contacted you as you asked, but not a day goes by without me wondering if you found what you were looking for. I don't want you to come back to a man who needs you to forgive him. I want you to come back only if you see the same future I do. One built from truth, not perfection. I still believe in us, but I believe in you more." There was no signature, just a single dried petal pressed between the fold. A pale lavender rose. She read it 3 times, then once more aloud. And for the first time in days, her chest opened. Not in pain, but in possibility. She pressed the paper to her chest and sat on the floor, heart racing, tears gathering, but not from sorrow, from clarity, because she finally understood something. She had left Cole to remember who she was, but in doing that, she had remembered why she loved him. Yet she didn't pack. Not yet, because there was one more thing she needed to paint, and she didn't know what it was yet. Only that it had been waiting for her in silence, just like he had. Morning arrived in shades of grey, dragging low clouds across the rooftop of the old Brooklyn house. Grace sat at the kitchen table, a paintbrush in one hand and a cup of cold tea in the other. The radio murmured an old jazz tune her grandmother used to hum, but none of it landed in her consciousness. She was consumed by the painting in front of her, or maybe by everything that had led to it. It was a self-portrait, but not of her face, only her hands. One reaching out, the other curled into a fist, both covered in the invisible ink of everything she had lost and everything she had let go. Then came the knock. Firm, measured. She blinked, glanced at the clock, barely 9 a.m. When she opened the door, she found an older man standing there, tall and composed, his white hair immaculately combed, wearing a dark wool coat and leather gloves. His eyes bore a resemblance to Cole's, same steel, same silence, but colder, like winter without snow. "Grace Sullivan?" he asked, his voice low and precise. She nodded cautiously. "I'm Richard Blake, Cole and Lucas's father." The air seemed to thin. "May I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside, saying nothing. Inside, he didn't look around, didn't comment on the old rugs, the chipped paint, or the scent of linseed oil and lavender that lingered in the air. He walked directly to the kitchen table, removed a thick envelope from the inside of his coat, and placed it gently between them. The paper was worn, the seal fragile, Two faint initials, CB, were scribbled in faded ink. "I'm not here to defend anyone," he said. "Not Lucas, and not Cole." Grace stood, arms crossed over her chest, guarding her heart from an impact she wasn't sure was coming. "Then why are you here?" He gestured toward the envelope. "Because you deserve the truth, not the version filtered through pain and pride. The whole of it." She stared at the envelope. "What is that?" "Cole's journal. He gave it to me years ago after your first art show. He didn't intend for you to read it, not then. And now, I think he's praying you will." She didn't reach for it. Not yet. Richard exhaled slowly. He didn't orchestrate the wedding disaster. He didn't manipulate Lucas into leaving. That was me. Her eyes snapped to his. "What?" "I paid Lucas to disappear." The room went still. Grace's breath caught. "You—" "I knew he wasn't ready for you. I knew he didn't love you the way a man should. Not fully, not faithfully. And I knew what my other son saw, what he tried and failed to deny." Grace staggered back a step. "You manipulated everything. I protected you from a man who would have broken you." His voice wasn't harsh, it wasn't emotional either. It was a man who had lived long enough to stop pretending he was noble. Cole found out later, and he was furious. That's when he gave me the journal, told me if anything ever fell apart, I was to give it to you. She looked down again at the envelope, a weight she hadn't asked to carry. "Why are you doing this now?" Richard's gaze softened, only slightly, "Because even I can recognize something rare when I see it. What you and my son shared, it wasn't about rescuing or saving. It was about finally being seen." She didn't speak. "Couldn't. Read it," he said gently. "Not because it'll fix everything, but because it'll remind you who he is, when no one's looking." And with that he turned, walked to the door and left. No further explanation, no plea, only the soft click of the front door closing behind him. It took Grace hours to open the envelope. She sat on the floor, back against the wall, the afternoon light falling in quiet stripes through the curtains. She held the journal in her lap, fingers brushing over the worn cover. When she finally flipped it open, her name stared back at her. Grace, October 12th. The handwriting was tight, slanted, unsure. I saw her again tonight. Not up close, just across the room, laughing with someone. I don't even think she knew I was there. But I couldn't stop watching. I wasn't supposed to go to that gallery. Lucas dragged me. He said the wine would be decent and the crowd would be predictable. But then she stepped in with paint under her fingernails, and the room felt different, real. It's strange how certain people don't try to take space, and still manage to change the air in it. She turned the page. More entries, moments, thoughts, observations, about her paintings, about her solitude, about her laughter. Not obsession, not control, just quiet recognition. A man seeing someone long before she knew she was visible. Grace read until night came, until the words blurred with tears she hadn't noticed falling. And then she found the final entry. "If I ever become brave enough to tell her everything, I hope she understands that loving her never felt like a choice. It felt like breathing." She closed the journal, pressed it to her chest, and sat there in the dark. Not broken, but beginning to mend. Because for the first time she realized she hadn't been lied to. She had been loved. In silence, in fear, in hope. And maybe now, it was her turn to decide what to do with that truth. The ballroom shimmered with gold and glass. Strings hummed under the chandelier light, the scent of peonies and polished wood drifting through the air like memory. It was the annual Blake Foundation Gala, an evening meant for elegance, applause, and appearances. But when Grace stepped into the room, silence followed her. She wore a simple black dress, no diamonds, no headlines, just grace. And yet, somehow, she stole the room from every jeweled neckline and every curated smile. Cole saw her the moment she entered. Across the sea of tuxedos and champagne flutes, she moved like a quiet answer to a question he hadn't dared ask aloud. He didn't approach her, not yet. He watched her speak briefly to the event coordinator, watched how some people turned, whispering, unsure what her presence meant. She wasn't on the guest list, but she was meant to be there, Everyone felt it, especially him. Grace had rehearsed nothing. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. She didn't even know she would, until she found herself standing in front of the closet reaching for that black dress, the one her grandmother had sewn by hand, the one she wore when she needed to remember who she was. Tonight wasn't about forgiveness. It was about choice, her own. She stepped onto the stage as the room quieted. No one had introduced her. No speech had been planned, but the microphone was there, and the moment waited for her. She took a breath, then began. "I wasn't supposed to be here tonight," she said, her voice clear, steady, "but a lot of things in my life didn't go the way they were supposed to." A soft ripple of unease passed through the audience. "I stood at an altar waiting for a man who didn't show up, and then another man, quiet, guarded, complicated, offered to take his place. Not to save me, but to shield me." Her eyes scanned the room, until they found him. Cole, standing still, barely breathing. He didn't ask me for love. He didn't promise me forever. He just offered me a way forward, and I took it, before I understood what it meant. The room was still, not frozen, just holding its breath. Grace continued. "I left him, not because he failed me, but because I didn't trust that I could be fully seen and still be loved. I carried wounds I thought I had painted over." She paused, softened. "And then I read his words. Not a speech, not a statement, just pages he never meant for anyone to see. And in them I found something I hadn't even realized I was searching for." She smiled gently. "A man who saw me before I saw myself." She stepped away from the microphone, down the small steps, and across the polished floor, eyes locked on his. When she reached him, her voice was just for him. "I choose you, Cole, not because you protected me, but because you waited for me to see it, and you never forced the ending." His chest rose, then fell. She reached for his hand, and the room, though full of applause, disappeared, because in that moment there was only this: two people, no longer defined by who they had been, but by what they had survived to reach each other. Later, after the lights dimmed and the guests disappeared into limousines and blurred city streets, Grace stepped out onto the side patio, heels in hand, the night air cool against her skin. She breathed deeply, as if trying to make space for something new. Cole joined her a few minutes later. No tuxedo jacket, no words, just him and her, standing in the quiet between all the noise. "You didn't have to say all that," he said softly. "I know. But you did." She turned to him. "Because truth deserves to be heard out loud." He nodded, then pulled something from his pocket. Small, velvet, but different this time. No grand setting, no stage, no pressure. He opened the box. Inside, a simple ring, a golden band, thin and quiet, like a secret only the two of them would share. "I don't want a contract," he said, "or a rescue story or redemption." He looked at her, voice low, sincere. "I just want you. Every version, every silence, every beginning." Her eyes filled, but no tears fell, because she wasn't breaking. She was whole and ready. But she didn't answer right away. She took the ring, closed the box gently, and placed it back in his hand, then whispered, "Ask me again. Tomorrow." The space smelled of fresh paint, flowers, and quiet anticipation. Grace stood at the center of the gallery on opening night, barefoot on the polished floor, watching as people moved slowly between the canvases. Her canvases. Her story. The walls weren't white. They were bone-colored, warm, welcoming. Nothing here was sterile. Everything breathed. Soft jazz floated through the room, unobtrusive. In one corner, a child held his mother's hand and pointed at a piece titled "Becoming." An older man paused in front of thread and silence and didn't move for almost 5 minutes. Grace didn't hover. She didn't explain. She let the work speak for itself, and in doing so, she finally heard her own voice. The exhibit wasn't just her art. It was also a platform for unknown names, young artists from community centers, women who had painted in secret for years, immigrants who expressed in color what they hadn't yet put into words. She had reached out personally to every one of them, and now their stories hung beside hers, stitched together by light and brushstroke, a living testament to what could bloom when someone felt seen. In the back room, tucked away from the crowd, stood something unexpected. A second gallery within the gallery, smaller, dimmer, more intimate. On the door, Grace, unframed. Inside, pieces no one had ever seen, pages from sketchbooks, a self-portrait drawn on the back of a grocery receipt, a letter she had written to herself the night she left Cole's apartment. Raw, unedited, real, and in the center of that quiet space, a photograph. Cole. Not posed, not prepared, just him. Standing on the edge of the Vermont lake, shirt sleeves rolled up, head tilted as if listening to the wind. Below it, a quote handwritten by Grace. "Sometimes the safest place is the one you never thought you'd choose." She didn't know when he had entered, but when she turned, he was already there, standing at the doorway, not moving, not speaking, watching. Not the crowd, not the walls, just her. She crossed the room, slow and deliberate, the noise behind them fading into hush. "You came," she said softly. "You didn't say I couldn't." She smiled. He stepped forward, opened a small velvet box, not black this time, blue. Midnight, like the lake at night. Inside, a new ring. Not larger, not louder, but unmistakably hers. An emerald, deep and imperfect, set in a brushed band that caught the light only when it chose to. He didn't kneel. He didn't ask. He just held it out, open-palmed. "I don't want a promise of perfection," he said. "I want the quiet choice we make every day to stay." Her throat tightened, because he wasn't offering forever. He was offering now, and again, and again. She took the ring, slid it on, held his gaze, and whispered, "Yes." Not because she had to, but because she could. 2 months later, the gallery had become more than a space, it was a rhythm. She taught workshops on Sundays, hosted open sketch nights on Thursdays, and every morning she painted with the windows open, the sounds of the city pouring in like breath. Cole split his time between meetings in Manhattan and afternoons in Brooklyn. He never asked her to choose between worlds. Instead, he offered to build a life that touched both, half in glass towers, half in crooked floorboards. They made tea in silence, danced barefoot in the hallway, read novels out loud until they fell asleep. And no one posted pictures. No one made announcements, because what they were building wasn't for show, it was for shelter. One evening, as twilight kissed the rooftops, Grace sat in her studio, a brush in one hand and Cole's sweater draped across her shoulders. She was working on a piece called Stillness in Motion, a swirl of blue and bone, memory and breath. Cole entered quietly, didn't interrupt, just leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, watching her like she was a prayer in progress. She looked over her shoulder. "What?" she asked. He smiled. "Just this. You. All of it." She tilted her head. "It doesn't feel like the end." "That's because it's not." She turned back to the canvas. And without looking at him, she asked, "Do you remember what you wrote in your journal?" He stepped forward. "Which part?" "The one that said, 'Loving me never felt like a choice.'" He nodded. "I think," she said slowly, "loving you felt like remembering something I never knew I'd forgotten." He didn't speak, just came closer, wrapped his arms around her from behind, and in the silence that followed, she knew. They hadn't found each other in the way stories were usually told. There were no fireworks, no rescues, no perfect lines, just two people meeting again and again in the quiet, where everything had truly begun. She hadn't expected flowers, nor promises, but she found a love that was built in silence, in waiting, and in the daily choice to stay. A love that didn't come to complete, but to walk beside. Because sometimes what seems like an end is just the place where something more true begins. And maybe, deep down, this story speaks of us too, and the courage to love again when no one else believes. If this story touched you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments. Where are you listening to this message from? Your support is what allows us to keep sharing stories that warm the soul.